Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this NQA webinar on the essentials updates to ISO 9001, the new ISO 9001 2015 standard. My name is Margaret Rooney. I am a regional assessor with NQA, and amongst my duties I am helping people prepare for the 2015 changes. This presentation is being recorded, and you will have an opportunity within a couple of days to listen to the recording. We will also send you a PDF version of the slides that are used. Please do submit any questions that you have. You will see a box in the bottom right-hand side of your screen called Chat. You may type in any questions that you may have. This webinar will last about an hour, and we will be allowing time at the end, the last 15 minutes or so, for questions. Do submit your questions, however, as we are going along. Don't wait to feel you have to wait till the very end. So any comments or thoughts that spring to mind during the presentation, you can note them down in that chat box. So the objectives of today: to give you knowledge and understanding of the significant changes to the 2015 standard, an understanding of the new requirements, and an overall summary of key changes and themes. We'll round off the presentation with that. So just to remind you of the Annex SL structure. Now, it's not the purpose of this webinar to go into any great detail on Annex SL. That's the subject of a separate webinar, and I'm sure a lot of you have already listened to that. But just to remind ourselves of this Annex SL, the structure of management system standards from here going forward. We have the scope, normative references, and terms and definitions. Then we have context of the organization, leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation, and improvement. And those 7 clauses are in blue for a reason, because these are the auditable sections of the management system standard, and these headings, these clause headings, are common to all management system standards. Today we are talking specifically about ISO 9001. So ISO 9001, as I've just explained, has adopted what we call the Annex SL framework. The high-level structure that we've just seen, the 10 clauses, identical core text within those clauses, common terms and definitions which are now used throughout all management system standards. 30% of the ISO 9001 2015 standard is Annex SL. It still contains a substantial amount of the 2008 text, and any of you that have read through the standard will have observed that. And there are some changes, specific changes in 9001 which have been made for the 2015 standard. So we'll do a clause-by-clause review of those auditable clauses that I mentioned. We're not going to do this in great detail. I'm going to highlight the important, significant changes, and of course you can always read the detail in the standard itself. So starting with context of the organization, the way I'm presenting this slide, on the left-hand side we have the Annex SL clauses, and on the right-hand side the clauses specific to 9001. Now, context of the organization, it's a high-level generic clause that carries over directly into 9001. Understanding the organisation and its context, this is the sub-clause. Again, we have exactly the same and the same core text in 9001. Understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. Just to remind ourselves, interested parties can be customers, employees, directors, boards of trustees, regulators, whatever the context of your organisation. And again, we have that direct requirement largely unchanged in 9001. Determining the scope of the management system, not surprisingly, in 9001 becomes determining the scope of the quality management system. And then the overall requirements for a management system in 9001, that becomes quality management system and its processes. So that's the first slight deviation, if you like, from the pure Annex SL requirements, that we have this enhanced emphasis in 4.4 on processes. The process approach is a very key element of the 2015 standard. On this slide, I have on the left-hand side items that are specific to 9001 that are over and above Annex SL requirements. So in this context of the organisation, not surprisingly, the standard refers to a quality management system, and there is a detailed section on processes. On the right-hand side, we're looking at what's changed overall between the 2008 standard and the 2015 standard. Well, we have the Annex SL requirements in 4.1 and 4.2, context interested parties. These are new requirements. These requirements, these terms did not appear in the 2008 standard. The reference to exclusions, or the term exclusions, has been removed in the section on scope, although there is a sentence that does indicate that you could argue, if you like, that a requirement is not needed if it does not affect the conformity of your product or service. And then we have, as I've mentioned on the left-hand side, we have this emphasis on the quality management system and its processes. So we have this elevated focus on processes both here and throughout the standard. We move now to the next auditable clause called leadership. And again, this is a change to note. This is a term that did not appear in the 2008 standards. The emphasis is on leadership, not just management. So top management or leaders now have to have, or be seen to have, a greater involvement in the management system, in this case the quality management system. And the requirements of the management system must be integrated into the organization's business processes. Now, this is another change from the 2008. The 2015 standard is much more business oriented and is really driving home the message that the quality management system must be there to support the business. It's not a standalone, isolated element. And really just building on that, therefore the policy and objectives must be compatible with the context and strategic direction of the organisation. A lot of you are perhaps thinking, we already do that. What's new about that? Well, in your case, nothing new. But for those of you who've perhaps not quite organised your management system in that way, this is something you need to start thinking about. So again, looking at the Annex SL requirements and how that carries over into 9001, we have requirement for leadership and commitment. And not surprisingly, we have that same requirement in 9001. However, we have some subclauses here, and this is partly an editorial thing that the 9001 standard writers have introduced, but also in 5.1.2 we have this subclause on customer focus. That is specific to 9001. And again, you're probably thinking, well, that's in the 2008 standard, and indeed it is. I think, however, there's an enhanced emphasis on it in the 2015. Then we have a requirement to have a policy, and this policy needs to be driven by the leadership. And again, we have that same requirement in the 9001 with some subclauses, editorial subclauses introduced to both develop the policy and communicate the quality policy. Organizational roles, responsibilities and authorities carries over directly from Annex SL, and again this is a generic management system requirement, not specific to 9001 but obviously reproduced within 9001. So looking on the left hand side at the 2015 9001 specific requirements, those additional subheadings that we saw on the earlier slide are largely editorial. However, the emphasis on the process approach that you'll find in this clause and on customer focus, that is additional to Annex SL. And then on the right hand side, what's changed since 2008 standard? Well, we have an emphasis on leadership and engagement in the 2015 standard. The policy must be applied across the whole organization and must be available as documented information. So again, this is something that's just emphasized a bit more in the 2015 standard. And we see straight away here a new term or a variation of a term that's come in with Annex SL and hence into the 2015 standard, this reference to documented information. So it's a change of terminology that we're looking at. And in organizational roles, responsibilities and authorities, there's no mention of a management representative. So that 2008 and earlier versions of the standard, which had a requirement to have an identified management representative, that explicit requirement has gone. However, if you have such a post and it works well for you, there's no need to change. There's nothing in the standard that says you can't have a management representative. Moving then to the next clause, planning, and again looking at the Annex SL clauses and the related associated 9001 clauses, we have this first requirement, actions to address risks and opportunities, and that carries over directly as the same general requirement in 9001. So this is the risk-based thinking that's come in with Annex SL and with the 2015 standard. Objectives and planning to achieve them. So we have our risks, we have our opportunities. How are we going to address those? Through our planning, through our setting of objectives. And not surprisingly, within our quality management system, they will be quality objectives and planning to achieve them. And then interestingly, in 9001 over and above Annex SL, we have this additional clause 6.3, planning of changes. And this is interesting and quite important, I think, because it's The emphasis, if you read the standard, the emphasis on planning of changes to the quality management system itself. And I think this is a recognition by the quality profession in the drafting of 9001 that management of change within a management system is very important. I think we've all at some time or other suffered from the effects of poor change management or lack of planning around change. So this is emphasised in the 2015 standard. So what's now changed in the 2015 standard since the 2008 version? Well, this overall requirement to address risks and opportunities is a new requirement. There is not that explicit requirement in 2008. And then in the requirement for quality objectives and planning to achieve them, there is stronger emphasis on objectives and planning. Now, the 2008 standard does talk about objectives, but the planning to achieve them, that emphasis is not in 2008. It is very clearly stated in the 2015 standard. And then this enhanced emphasis on planning of system changes. This is both new to 9001 and in addition to the basic Annex SL requirements. So that's an important thing for the quality profession to take on board. And again, can I just remind you, do take advantage if you have any questions or comments, any feedback you'd like to give us at this stage, do take the opportunity to type that into the box, the chat box. Right, moving to clause 7, the support clause, again looking at the Annex SL requirements, we have the same clause title obviously in 9001 because that's now the new management system standard requirements. And then we have a number of sub-clauses. We have a sub-clause, resources, and we have that same sub-clause in 9001. However, the blue text, those sub-clauses if you like, they are in addition to Annex SL. So the quality profession in drafting 9001 has taken advantage of the opportunity to spell out more clearly, more explicitly, what we feel is important by way of general resources. I'll come back to that in a moment. Then we have the overall requirements around competence, awareness, communication, and not surprisingly, those same requirements stated in fairly generic terms because it's equally applicable to 9001 as other management system standards. Those same sub-clauses are in 9001. Then we have the requirement for documented information, and again some sub-clauses around that, further sub-clauses, general requirements, creating and updating, control of documented information. There's really nothing terribly new there other than the terminology. In the past, the standards would have talked about procedures or manuals or records or work instructions, but here we have just a generic term, documented information. And not surprisingly, that carries over into 9001. And in general, looking at that clause, it's not terribly different to what we're already used to in our management system. So looking at what is specific to 9001 over and above Annex SL, the resources sub-clause is very detailed compared to the Annex SL requirements, as we saw in the earlier slide. So the quality profession has added its own more detailed requirements around people, infrastructure, environment for the operation of processes, monitoring and measuring resources, and organisational knowledge. What's changed from the 2008-9001? There is an emphasis on external and internal resources. I think it's fair to say in 2008 the emphasis was more on internal communications, internal resources. The 2015 standard has more emphasis on external also. Examples of infrastructure are cited in the 2015 standard. Buildings, for example, utilities, equipment, transport, IT, these are all examples of infrastructure which might be quite key to your business. And there's more guidance for the environment or environment for the operation of processes in the form of a note. Now, for example, it talks about human and physical factors, cultural factors, temperature, humidity, lighting. In other words, the environment, not just for the processes themselves, but for the comfort of people working in that environment. Just to point out, a note in the standard is guidance. It's not a requirement. So there's some quite useful guidance around infrastructure and environment in the 2015 standard. But largely this clause 7 support is covering the 2008 clauses 6 and 7.6. 6 addressing resources, 7.6 addressing calibration, control of equipment. Organizational knowledge, now this is a new requirement. It's a new requirement since 2008, and it is a requirement over and above the Annex SL requirements. And again, I'll come back to that a little bit later on, but this is clearly something that the quality profession has determined is important. Some further changes from 2008. The competence and awareness requirements, the old 6.2 in the earlier standard, this requirement has been extended to include outsourced personnel. As I mentioned earlier, there's more emphasis generally on the external as well as the internal requirements. So if you are appointing external personnel, subcontractors, outsourcing in any way, you may need to look at the competence of those people. It'll depend on how critical the activities are that they're carrying out for you, the extent to which you need to look at that competence. Everybody, internal and outsourced, must be aware of the policy and objectives. The requirements around communication, these are more prescriptive and, as I keep saying, also includes external requirements, in this case external communications. And then we have this new term, documented information. There's no mention of manual, procedures or records, or more to the point, those terms are not used. That doesn't stop you carrying on having those things and using that terminology. You're not going to change your management system overnight simply because an ISO standard terminology changes. You keep the terminology and the documentation structure that works for you. Then we have clause 8, operation. Now, this is the core activities. What does your organization actually exist to do? The things that make the money, if you like, are going to be covered in this clause 8, the operations, the core processes. It's a very short clause in Annex SL because this is where each management system standard has the greatest scope for determining its own specific requirements. And for that reason, it's a very big clause in 9001 2015. And just by way of comparison, if any of you are familiar with the 14001 2015 standard, you will see that it's a fairly short clause in the 14001 compared to a pretty lengthy clause in 9001. So in the black type here, I have operational planning and control. It's quite a short clause that's lifted directly, introductory clause lifted directly from Annex SL. Then in the blue text, we have the specific 9001 requirements. I'm not really going to dwell on these because there's not much difference between this and the existing 2008 requirements. So we have our requirements for our products and services, and that includes customer communication, determining of those requirements, reviewing those requirements, managing changes to those requirements. And then for those of you who are doing design or design and development, again, we have our general requirements around that. We have our planning for that, our inputs to design, our controls within that design, the outputs of that design, and any changes that may be needed. And my advice, just a little hint if you like, even if you don't do design and development, I do think that the way this clause is presented is a very nice illustration of the process approach. So I would take a minute or two to just read through 8.3, and if you were to replace the terms design and development with process or with the name of your own process, I think this is a nice guide. So we plan our process, we plan our inputs to the process, or we recognize our inputs, we determine the controls within that process, then we have outputs to the process, and we think about how we manage changes to the process. So when it comes to the process approach, process thinking, I think that you might find that helpful. I acknowledge that's perhaps something of a personal view. Then we have 8.4, control of externally provided processes, products and services. And again, we have our general requirements, the type and extent of control we might need. That's actually a way of stating risk, and I'll come back to that in a moment. What information do we need to provide for our external providers? And then we have our overall production and service provision, the core of what we do. So we have our controls around that, our identification and traceability requirements if we have them. How do we manage property belonging to our customers or external providers? And I think that is something additional to the 2015 standard. The requirements around preservation, if it's a product, post-delivery activities, any commitments that we have after we have completed the service or delivered the product, control of any changes during the production, release of those products and services, and control of our non-conforming outputs. There's really nothing terribly new in any of this, and those of you that have been working some time with the 9001 standard will see a lot of very familiar things there. So in general, Clause 8 is very detailed, very clear in my view, presented in a more business-like way. Again, I think if you read through Clause 8 carefully, it is a lot of the language, shall we say, it has been softened. It is a more overall more friendlier to business. Sets design out as a process very well in my view, and sits very much in our quality management system comfort zone. So it largely addresses the old, not old because lots of us are still using it, but it largely addresses the 2008 Clause 7, product realisation, and 8.3, control of non-conforming products. So nothing terribly new in Clause 8. Performance evaluation. Now we're getting into the how are we doing, the monitoring and measuring elements. We've carried out our processes. How are we doing? So evaluation is a new requirement or a new term in 9001. It's already used in ISO 14001, and indeed it's a term that is now in Annex SL. An evaluation is about reaching a judgment. It's not just monitoring, measuring, analysing, it's reaching a judgment, perhaps a professional judgment, taking all factors into consideration, taking the context into consideration. So it's evaluating. So it's not just saying something is right or wrong, but in a given set of circumstances, this is acceptable or this is not acceptable. And within performance evaluation, we also have internal audit. Not much change from the 2008 requirements, but it's been extended or enhanced to remind us, if you like, when we're carrying out our internal audits, to remember to look at how we're managing our customer feedback, our organizational changes, and our quality objectives. If you cast your mind back, we don't just have objectives, we need to be planning carefully how to achieve those objectives. That activity should be included within our internal audit process. Management review, no significant changes really. Those of us that are familiar with the management review process won't really see much difference in the 2015 requirement. So looking at the Annex SL requirements, we have a requirement for monitoring, measurement, analysis and evaluation, and we have that same requirement in 9001 with these further sub-clauses, and in particular 9.1.2 customer satisfaction. That's over and above the Annex SL requirement, and hence that's in blue. In general, the sub-clauses are in blue because Annex SL does not subdivide that clause in the way that 9001 does. Then we have our requirement for internal audit as part of our performance, one of the tools in our performance evaluation kit, and not surprisingly we have that same requirement in 9001, and again management review carries over into 9001. We have these sub-clauses here which are really editorial. There's no change between the basic Annex SL requirement and the 9001 requirement. So looking at this Clause 9, performance evaluation, what do we have in 9001 that is over and above Annex SL? Well, we have this emphasis on customer satisfaction and the fact that evaluation of data and its use is to improve the quality management system. So the reference to customer satisfaction, customer focus, these are very much specific to 9001. You won't, not surprisingly, you won't necessarily see that in other management system standards. Despite what I said, there are a few additional requirements or enhancements in the management review requirements. We're reminded to take into consideration customer satisfaction, external provision, and process performance. So what's changed since 2008? There's this enhanced emphasis or additional requirement, if you like, on evaluation of results. So that's reaching a judgment based on information. Monitoring should be based on risk, and the reminder to have this risk-based thinking is there throughout the standard, but what we monitor, the extent to which we monitor, will depend on risk. Customer perception, or the customer feedback, now includes, you must solicit perceptions about the organisation itself as well as the products and services. Some of you are probably already doing this, but if not, you may need to think about this. So it's not just how was our product, was it, was it what you were expecting, did it arrive on time, and so forth, but perhaps what are we like as an organization to work with? So, and the terms preventive action and statistical techniques, they're no longer referenced. These are not terms that we see in the 2015 standard. And there's no explicit requirement for a documented procedure for internal audit and management review. And that's maybe going to surprise quite a few people, because we've drummed that message home for so long that you must have a documented procedure for these things. However, you do need documented information as evidence that you've carried out those activities. So I think in general the requirements around documented information in the 2015 standards is more about having evidence that things have taken place rather than having a documented procedure. And moving to the last auditable clause, this is the improvement clause, and this is where you address non-conformity and corrective action. Now, if you cast your mind back to clause 8, there is a requirement to control non-conformity. In clause 8, it's about containing the immediate problem and what you're going to do about it. That would be to stop poor product or service reaching the client. In the improvement clause, it's about are there any trends in our non-conformities? The root cause analysis that you've carried out, is that revealing trends or significant improvements that may need to be made? So that's the importance of non-conformity and corrective action in this clause 10. So the requirements here, I would suggest, are familiar and well understood. What about preventive action? Again, wasn't there always a documented procedure requirement for this? It doesn't appear, because in fact one of the objectives of a management system is preventive action. The very act of having a management system is to be introducing preventive action. So again, just looking at the Annex SL requirements and how that transmits to 9001, we have the overall clause improvement. Straight away, 10.1 in 9001 is actually additional to Annex SL. So we have a general statement around improvement. I'll come back to that in a moment. Then we have non-conformity and corrective action, not surprisingly carries over as 10.2 now in 9001. Continual improvement, and we have that same requirement in 9001. So items specific to the 2015 9001 over and above Annex SL is this general requirement for improvement, and linked to that really, and the change that has taken place since 2008. 10.1 actually says there needs to be proactive improvement. So you must proactively seek improvement, and you will find that perhaps as a result of the corrective actions that you've had to carry out. innovation, bright ideas people have had, or reorganization. A reorganization may take place in order to bring about or help bring about improvements. So that 10.1 is really emphasizing the need to be proactive in seeking improvements. So again, it's interesting that the quality profession has seen a need, recognized a need to introduce that. And as I've already mentioned, the explicit requirement for a preventive action procedure has gone. So just to sum up so far, we have some changes in emphasis and terminology. New terminology, we have context, process approach and risk-based thinking, leadership planning, strategic direction, documented information. These are elements of new terminology, new concepts, if you like, that are coming in. The black text is lifted directly from Annex SL. The blue text relates more to 9001. And then organizational knowledge and externally provided products and services. These are really very much 9001 requirements. So there's just new terms that we're all rapidly, some of us gradually, some of us rapidly becoming used to. And I'm not going to dwell on this table, and don't try to read it now because you will receive a copy of it, but just a little summary of a comparison of the changes in terminology. And just to confuse you, 2008 is on the left-hand side in this one. So just very briefly, for example, documentation and records, that's now changed to documented information. Management representative is a term no longer used in the 2015 standard. Now, I'd just like to quickly finish off with just focusing in on process, risk, and organizational knowledge, because these are new themes in the 9001. So there is a section 0 in 9001 that's worth having a look at, and we have the process approach identified, explained here, and we have a general introduction to the process approach, the fact that it's very much linked to the plan, do, check, act cycle, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. We're also introduced to risk-based thinking. So what is this process approach? Well, just again, lifting some text out of the standard itself, the process approach ensures understanding and consistently meeting requirements. Processes should be linked to added value. That's the point of defining and managing our processes. We need to look at our processes to ensure that we're getting effective performance. And improvement of processes relies on measurement. It relies on having data and information about our processes and being able to evaluate that. And we need to think about risk within our processes, and I'll come back to that. And just very simply, we have the diagram here, flow chart. Again, many of you will be familiar with the fact that we have requirements which become inputs. We have our operations. We have outputs from those operations, and ultimately we have those outputs may well feed into other processes, and ultimately we have our final outputs, our products and services. And just overlaid on that, if you like, are the points where we might need to think about risk. Now, in fact, you're probably thinking a lot more about risk than you realize. So risk-based thinking, it's been implicit in earlier versions, and this is why I say you've probably been thinking more about risk than you realise. So preventive action is a risk reduction mechanism. So we have our plans to address risks and opportunities. Opportunities bring with them perhaps some associated risk. And really we have here in this last point the definition of risk. It's the effect of uncertainty, and uncertainty can bring positive or negative effects. So it's about how we manage uncertainty in our management system. Now the standard in various places actually does link process and risk, and it's captured in terms and phrases such as, where we talk about is appropriate to or context. That's a way of expressing risk. Potential impact on the conformity of product. That potential impact is a way of expressing risk, is a measure of risk. Objectives shall be relevant to conformity of products. Again, a way of thinking about risk. Very much a statement of risk-based thinking, potential consequences of failure. What's the risk? And again, the need to ensure there is no adverse impact on conformity is another way of expressing risk. Again, please don't try to study this matrix in detail at this point, because you will have an opportunity afterwards. But this is, I think, a very, very helpful matrix, which was actually put together by a colleague of mine, so I can't claim any credit for it whatsoever, but it is, in my view, extremely helpful. So we have our subject areas and our 9001 references on the left-hand side. What I really want to draw your attention to is the terminology in that first row on the right-hand side. We have terms like risk, complex, impact, effect, likelihood, consequence. These are all terms linked to risk. And as you can see, the standard is peppered throughout with references to risk. We're not necessarily using the term risk. And indeed, the 2008 standard is also peppered with many of these terms. So you're already working with risk. The 2015 standard is simply being more explicit on the subject of risk. Organizational knowledge, this is specific to 9001, very well defined in my view in that clause 716. It's specific to the organization, gained by experience, and is used and shared to help achieve your objectives. People work together in an organization, they communicate, they chat to each other. There's actually an informal sharing of knowledge that's going on all the time. We have our internal sources of knowledge, our colleagues. We have our external sources, our clients, our suppliers. Perhaps we attend conferences or professional organizations. And to summarize, in the 2015 standard and linked to Annex SL, I think there are changes and there are significant changes, and we've covered both in this presentation. So just to tease this out a little bit, there's reduced emphasis on documentation or the need for documented procedures. There's no explicit requirement for a management representative. There's no explicit reference to preventive action. And there's some new terminology. So those are changes. As quality professionals and as auditors, what are the significant changes? Elevated focus on the process approach, risk-based thinking, including opportunities, And I hope you find that matrix helpful in this respect, the one I showed earlier. And of course, Annex SL itself. Annex SL is a significant change because it now impacts on all management system standards and will change what we audit and how we audit. So, what do I need to do? Well, actually, what I'm saying here is, what do you need to do? So what you need to do, details of what you need to do to transition to the new standard have been sent to you, or should have been sent to you. And all certified companies will need to have transitioned by September 2018. So you can do this at the pace that suits yourselves. We have a small number of organizations that have already transitioned, but many are in no hurry to do so. Contact us if you haven't seen information on transition, on how to transition, or if you still have some further questions, if you need any further help with that. So I'll now address questions and discussion points, and just to remind you that you will be sent a recording of this webinar or a link to it, and you will be sent copies of the slides. So I'm just going to move now to questions that have come in, and there's been quite a few, which is good. So Peter Christmas, hello Peter, says he's just checking understanding on one point. You said that quality policy must apply across the whole organization. Does this mean that all of the organization's areas of activity are within scope of the quality management system, and it is no longer possible to exclude some areas of activity from the scope? No, Peter, and I'm sorry if there's been a misunderstanding here. You define the scope and you set the boundary of your management system. So it's everyone and everything within that boundary that you've set. All those people would need to be aware of the quality policy. And even if there are individuals sitting outside of the scope, you may just need to think about, would they need to know or be aware of it? I'm just thinking of external communications and questions that people might have. But no, you determine the scope, you determine who's within the scope, you determine who needs to know. But really anybody who has an impact, has an effect on your management system. Jennifer McLeod says, is actions to address risks and opportunities really a new requirement? Is the fact we have a quality management system with procedures that address certain processes, not actions to address risks? What further evidence would an auditor look for that risks and opportunities have been identified and addressed? Well, Jennifer, I couldn't agree with you more. I think, as I tried to say, many of you are already working with these risks and opportunities. That's precisely what you're doing in your management system. So what further evidence would we look for? Speaking for myself, I think as an assessor, I'm just more mindful of risk. So I'm more likely to frame my questions around risk. But I'm mindful of what that other terminology within the management system. So in terms of further evidence, we might just be looking for an understanding of risk and just ensuring that you have actually considered all the risks that might be relevant. I hope I pronounced this correctly, Mururo, I'm not going to try your second name, Mururo, I'm sorry, but thank you for your question. With such allowance for variation in requirements in the 2015 version, how will auditors conduct an objective test of a company's quality management system? That's a very big question. How will we conduct an objective test or an objective line of inquiry in the way I hope that we've always done? We listen to what you say. We consider what you've said. We'll ask you questions, and we'll be looking for objective evidence. And I know what you're thinking. What's objective evidence? Historically, we've probably focused on the written word. But I think in future we need to focus more on listening to you and your colleagues. Are you all telling us the same story? That would be part of the objective test that we'll do. So I hope that helps you. If you're still unsure, do contact us or have this conversation with your assessor. Even if you're not transitioning, next time you're with your assessor, do have this conversation, and that goes for all of your questions. Do have these conversations with your assessor. Is it correct that you don't need a traditional quality manual and that auditors will be looking to see standards amalgamated? Sorry, this is a question from Ian Little. No, we don't need to see the standards amalgamated, Ian. If you want to keep your systems quite separate. I assume you mean integrated systems. No, we're not expecting to see integrated systems. We encourage them, but we don't expect it. Traditional quality manual, you don't need, and we don't need to see a traditional quality manual if you choose not to have one. The standard amalgamation, just to go back to that point, the amalgamation is Annex SL. That has given standards a common structure. It's a common structure rather than an amalgamation. Again, Ian asks, if we don't need manual procedures or records, what evidence will auditors be looking for? Well, actually, Ian, we will need to see a lot of records. And if you look through the 2015 standard, you will see a lot of reference to documented information as evidence. So there is a big requirement for records, but procedures, you will have procedures, but they may not necessarily be written down. But as long as you've got them, or as long as you know what your processes are. Right, then I have Laura. Laura McCartney says, can we get a copy of the 2015 standards? You need to purchase these, Laura. You can purchase them directly from the ISO organization itself, and it's iso.org. So if you go on to or Google iso.org, that will take you into their website and give you details of how to order and how to purchase the standard. Carla Gomez says, I think you're asking, Carla, can you have a certificate of this webinar? If you mean a certificate or confirmation that you've listened to it, yes, you can. Could you please contact us after this and we can organize that for you. I'm assuming that you're thinking of CPD points, and indeed that goes to any of you who are listening. Thank you very much, Carla. She just paid me a compliment, I think, so thank you for that. And thank you, Peter, for your feedback. That my explanation, my clarification did make sense to you, so that's good to hear. That's all questions and comments for today. Thank you very much indeed. Those were very good, if I may say, very good thought-provoking questions, and it's always good for you to keep us auditors on our toes. I'd like to thank you very much for taking time out of your busy day, and I suspect for many of you, time out of your lunchtime. So thank you very much indeed. We do appreciate you